Hello, America and the world, and welcome to the Rafe Foreman podcast. Today, I'm going to talk to you about something that you hear me say every podcast, and that is we make our decisions based on what's familiar to us. Well, how do we become familiar with things? Well, I'm going to give you one way that we do that now on the podcast. It's called imprinting. Let me give you an illustration of imprinting and what I mean by that. My wife and my two daughters raise horses, and frequently we'll have a colt or a filly be born on the property. And the very instant that this little baby horse hits the ground and is expelled from its mother's, the mare's body, they are absolutely on the little critter, introducing him or her to everything that they're going to be introduced to in their life. They'll put a halter on the little baby. They'll let him smell feed, introduce him to water, hay, combs, music, because there's usually a radio on in the barn, feed sacks, noisy, crinkly pieces of paper or plastic, just everything they can think of that will come into this colt's life or this filly's life. And it's amazing because they use hair clippers and nail, the things they trim their hooves with. And later on in life, when they have to trim the horse's hooves or comb his hair, or cut it, he's not skittish because he has, on the very first day of his life, been imprinted with these things that he's going to experience later on in his life. And it really does work. And I can tell you that it works on human beings as well. Think of a time when you're listening to the radio, you're driving down the street or you're at your house, wherever you listen to the radio or music, and a particular song comes on, and then months, days, or years later, you hear that same song and you're transported back to whatever it was you were doing. You're not thinking about the song. You're thinking about, I was on a trip to XYZ, or I was on my way to the doctor's office when I heard this song. That is an example of imprinting. Now, the song isn't necessarily related to the experience that you recall. So how is it that the song prompts you to recall the situation or the experience? It's imprinting. And it's kind of a fascinating thing that we need to think about, because you're going to hear me talk about psychodrama, which was introduced to me in my life in about 2002. And I have about 6,000 or 7,000 hours of psychodrama since then. And so I'm quite experienced in psychodrama. And I can tell you that having seen some psychodramas 20 years ago, I can still remember them as if it were yesterday. They were imprinted on me. Now, I can't remember a phone conversation I had 2 hours ago or who I might have talked to yesterday. So how in the world is it that I can remember a story, an experience of another 20 years later, other than the explanation of imprinting? Well, so let's just set our deniability aside for a moment and think about this. If I can remember the story of another person for over 20 years, don't you think that a jury can remember it for one day while they're doing their deliberations, or a week of your trial? You start to see how critically important imprinting is. Imprinting makes things familiar. If you've had this experience before, it's easier for you to go there again. It's imprinted on you. You know the way, you know the path, you know the result, you know what your expectations are. So, how do you imprint people? In conversation, maybe you're trying to get a raise and you want to imprint the idea of a raise on your boss. Maybe you're trying to persuade a jury to see justice in a way that justifies your client. So we have to come up with some examples of how do we imprint, because it's not just speaking. I mean, think about it. Whether you go to church or you go to lectures or you listen to a blog or podcast, somehow you're getting the spoken word into your ears and into your head. What is it that imprints it on you instead of just being blah, 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 and you promptly forget it 5 minutes after you hear it? Well, I don't know how it works for you, but I know how it works for me. I see pictures in my head. And some people are creative enough that they can create word play and word structure that engage me and cause me to create pictures. However, I'm a daydreamer, and so I'm bad about daydreaming, and I create pictures on my own pretty regular. And so what I want you to think about is, what is it that causes you to create pictures in your mind when you hear a song, or when you're going to, let's say, a road trip, or when you're just laying alone in your bed with your thoughts? How is it that you can remember some of those thoughts for years later, and you cannot remember to pay your energy bill every month? Well, it has to do with focus. Imprinting directs your focus to that which is familiar, to which you've experienced before. And that is so critically important, because it triggers a part of the brain that is long-term memory. The problem is, and you don't have to understand how the brain works, and I'm not claiming that I'm an expert on it, but I can tell you that there is a short-term memory function and a long-term memory function. And if you have an opportunity to speak with someone who suffers an infirmity in one of those areas, you'll quickly understand what I'm talking about. I've had traumatic brain injured clients who, for example, they remember how to look up the pizza number in the phone book. They know how to dial the phone. They order a pizza, but in the 30 minutes it takes from them to order the pizza and the pizza to arrive, they don't know what the pizza guy's doing there. They're like, I didn't order a pizza. I've had that short-term memory infirmity. I've also had clients who, for example, had to write down instructions, because I had a client that he was supposed to be a best man in a wedding. He got all dressed up, wearing a tuxedo, started driving to the church, but on the way, he can't remember where he's going or why he's all dressed up, and he misses the wedding. And so he has to write himself instructions so that when he gets lost or forgets, he can look at the notebook and see what he's supposed to do. Those are short-term memory problems. Let's take a pause and a brief second to thank our sponsor for today. And our sponsor for today's podcast is us, the Rafe Foreman Podcast. We encourage you to follow us on Patreon, and we would encourage you also, if you feel like it, to give us a good review on Google and Apple Podcasts and wherever you give good reviews. Thank you, and now we'll return to the podcast. Imprinting does affect short-term memory in some ways, but it also, more importantly, affects long-term memory. So, for example, this particular client that I was talking to you about who missed the wedding remembers me because I have been in his life well before the time that he got injured. And so his memory is not necessarily limited to those experiences he had before the traumatic brain injury, but they are more prevalent. So when I talk to him, I always notice that he's talking about things that happened years ago. They were imprinted on him. So what's my point? My point is, imprinting is so powerful that it even works and has a lasting effect on those people who are brain damaged by automobile crashes or whatever caused their brain injury. So you need to think about that. So let's focus now that you've bought into the idea that imprinting is an important thing. How do you imprint? Well, we've already talked about music. We've already talked about physical touch. We've already talked about noise. We've already talked about introducing foreign objects to a colt or a filly. But think about it. Think about something that's been imprinted on you. And I'm going to give you an example. My poor sister died of COVID at 54, almost 2 years ago. And I can still remember a road trip that she and I took. She had a black and silver Chevrolet Silverado, and it was a short bed, if you know what that means. The bed wasn't 7 or 8 feet long. It was a short bed. That was a sporty little truck, and we were driving our happy selves to watch the Texas A&M Aggies play the LSU Tigers over in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And we were driving from College Station on the way to Baton Rouge. And I was acting a fool. You know, I was excited to be there. We had to be there in time for midnight yell practice on Friday night. And so we're driving, and I'm driving too fast and probably too reckless. And my sister, I don't remember any of that. What I do remember is the look on my sister's face of disappointment. You know, I'm driving her prized possession, her brand new pickup, probably too fast and a little dangerously. But instead of scolding me and getting on to me, she is sitting there sick to her stomach because she's worried about what's going to happen. That look brings all these memories back. It always has and always will. Every time my sister looked at me with a look of disappointment, it was imprinted on me from probably earlier than that point in time, but from that example that I'm giving you. Now that was in 1984. We're in 2022. And yet it's such a powerful memory to me that I can tell you what it smelled like in the truck. I can tell you the leaves and the coloration of the leaves on the trees outside the vehicle. I can tell you the roads. I can see the surface of the highway. All of these things are stuck in my memory, and that's because imprinting engages something that I don't understand, but it heightens our sensitivity and awareness. And because it heightens our sensitivity and awareness, it triggers our long-term memory. So there you go. Now, what did we learn from that? We learned that sometimes it's traumatic events that imprint on us. Unfortunately, we all know that too well. A victim of a sexual assault is imprinted for life, not in a good way. But also songs. You know, you have a favorite song or a song you haven't heard in a long time, and that makes you happy and joyful. So I don't want you to think imprinting is a result of trauma only. It certainly can be a result of trauma, but it also can be a result of love or extreme joy. And so what I want you to do is create a series of exercises. And the first one is list some things that have been imprinted on you, because we're all different. I can't tell you what's imprinted on you because I don't know you. I can only share some things that are imprinted on me. So write a list of, it doesn't have to be exhaustive. We're trying to learn how to imprint on others. Write down some things that are imprinted on you. The second step of the equation is write down your thoughts as to why these were imprinted on you. And number 3, write down your experience of how these were imprinted on you. George Strait used to have a song called The Chair. And his lyrics are something like, well, excuse me, but I think you've got my chair. And he's making it up. She really didn't have his chair. He just used that as a pickup line to get her to dance. But I remember that song because I was in law school when it came out. So that means that song came out between 1986 and 1988, because those are the 3 years I was in law school. What can I see when I hear that song? I see the Whataburger on Q and 19th Street in Lubbock, Texas, because that's where I was when I first heard that song. I was in my pickup and driving through the drive-in window of that Whataburger, and I can still smell that Whataburger with the mustard on it. Now, it doesn't have anything to do with the song, but the song has imprinted itself on me at the time and the place that I heard it. And so when I hear the song about George Strait saying, excuse me, you've got my chair, I go immediately back to that place. Now, it wasn't a particularly happy memory for me, and it wasn't a traumatic memory. So how in the world has that been imprinted on me for me to remember 33, 34, 35 years later? Well, remember what I told you about our heightened awareness. I had heard bits and pieces of this song, but never the whole thing. And back in the day, we didn't have iPads. We didn't even have cell phones. You know, you couldn't just push it up on your playlist and play it. If you didn't have it on an 8-track tape, you had to wait till the radio had mercy on you and played it. And so finally, I had it on KLLL radio in Lubbock, and they've played this song, and I was sort of elated. I mean, not like you win the lottery elated, but I was happy I was going to get to hear this song. And so I guess that's what led to the imprinting of my surroundings on my memory. Now, I want you to notice something. Every time I hear that song, I think about that Whataburger. But every time I go to Whataburger, I do not think about that song. In fact, Whataburger doesn't trigger that song for me at all. Isn't that an interesting phenomenon? Because you would think one begat the other, but it's not true. At least for me. It might be true for you, but it's not true for me. There's a whole lot of experiences I've had at Whataburger, some good, some bad, some hot, some cold. But those memories at Whataburger do not trigger this song, but this song does the opposite. So I want you to think about that. And as you think about what imprints on you and how it becomes imprinted on you and the extent of its imprintation, if that's a word, on you, I want you to think then, how can you duplicate that? So, for example, take an experience that you would like to have. You haven't had it yet, or maybe you have and you want to redo it or you want to re-experience it. Think of that experience. Listen to the radio, listen to some poetry, listen to TV, talk with a friend, a significant other, and then write down your findings about what got imprinted on you while you were reliving or creating this experience for the first time in your mind. It's just an interesting thing, and I think you'll learn some things about imprinting. In summary, I want to close today by saying what becomes imprinted on us sort of attaches itself to our DNA. It certainly attaches itself to our long-term memory, and it can be reaccessed both voluntarily and involuntarily for many years in our life. Therefore, a tool of persuasion, a tool of connection, is this process known as imprinting. I want to thank you for listening to the podcast today. I want to warn you about imprinting. Works both ways. If you imprint negative things on a person or on yourself, you get negative results. So be careful. Be good to yourself. Don't be too hard on yourself, and We'll see you in the next podcast. Please join us every Tuesday and Thursday for new podcasts and new materials. And also, we hope you'll support us on Patreon, and we will have exclusive materials, lessons, teachings, and even videos coming soon. Good verdicts to all.